Last year, the state of Vermont made possession of small amounts of marijuana, or cannabis, as it's sometimes referred to, legal within the state. All told, 10 states and Washington, D.C. have now legalized marijuana for recreational use for adults over the age of 21, and 33 states have legalized medical marijuana. The next step for Vermont may be to implement a tax and regulate structure for cannabis. While last year's legalization may have made possession of small amounts of marijuana or a handful of homegrown plants legally okay, it left unanswered the question of how someone obtains it in the first place. Setting up a network of state-regulated dispensaries, similar to that already in place for liquor and alcohol sales, would eliminate that gray area, as well as offer a possible new source of taxable revenue for the state. But concerns among many remain that this step hasn't been completely thought through, and the lack of an easy-to-use and reliable roadside test to enable law enforcement officers to determine if someone is operating a vehicle while impaired is troubling. We went out and talked to several people on the front lines of this issue. We started with Senator Dick Sears, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who has crafted legislation that would tax and regulate the sale of cannabis.
I look at the tax and regulate system as a consumer safety issue. Somebody currently buys marijuana legally from somebody who's selling it illegally. They don't know what they're buying, they don't know the quality, and frankly, this bill would provide the regulations necessary to ensure that the product is what it says it is. If you think about it and compare it with alcohol, when somebody buys moonshine, they have no idea what's in it, and they don't know. So, we developed a system with alcohol where the state sells a regulated product. So I don't see it as any different with marijuana. We do know that about 80,000 Vermonters use marijuana, according to the RAND report, and that's a sizable number. Now, obviously, some will be able to go to Massachusetts, go down to Williamstown, Mass, or Pittsfield very shortly and buy marijuana, and that's the new system. So this would bring Vermont in line with that. It'll take about 18 months from the time that the bill passes till we can have actual retail sales. There would be the commission, a cannabis commission would be formed, and the costs of the regulation, the commission, the testing, etc., would be borne by fees to those who either cultivate or sell the product and distribute the product. So those fees would cover that cost. The 10% tax would go into the general fund and would fund whatever we, the legislature and the governor, through the normal appropriations process, thought was necessary. The commission had put aside large amounts of money for public safety and for health and education, and we just felt that should just go through a regular appropriations process. If they feel they needed extra money from the revenue, which would, and so that's why we recommend 10%. The 10% would make us much more competitive with the illegal market. Our goal here is to, as much as possible, interfere with that market and make the black market go somewhere else.
Following the passage last year of the legalization of small amounts of cannabis, a state commission was established to study the approaches to taxing and regulating. One of the members of that commission is Jake Perkinson. A difference between their report and the legislation being supported by Senator Sears is the tax rate that would apply to cannabis sales. Senator Sears and a number of his Senate colleagues think a 10% excise tax is about right. The commission opted for one of 20%.
Right. So the tax department did quite a bit of analysis in looking at other states, particularly Colorado and Oregon and Washington, and also matching that up against what the recommendations for the programs recommended by the committee were. So the idea was to see how we could fund the recommended programs and what tax rate would be necessary to reach that funding level. And that's how we reached the 20% baseline tax rate at the retail level. And that really, the tax rate that ultimately was recommended is pretty much in the median range of what is applicable in other states. Other states have different tax structures where they tax it both at the wholesale and the retail, or in a lot of different machinations. And so I certainly understand what I believe is the motivation behind the lower tax rate, which is that you want to be competitive with the black market rates. And if you are going to legalize, I certainly do subscribe to the policy position that one strong argument for legalization is the elimination of a black market. And I haven't had a direct discussion with Senator Sears as to why the 10% was elected, but I think that probably has a pretty strong influence on having a lower rate. My concern with a lower rate is that it would fail to provide adequate funding, not only for the programs that are recommended, but also just for basic levels of enforcement.
William Deveneaux, a tax attorney based in Bennington, also spoke to this point.
Because there's going to be a lot of front-loaded costs of bringing on all the infrastructure to regulate this. So we don't want to have the tax rate too small, so then we can't pay for all the front load costs plus all the additional costs ongoing of regulating. But it's a balancing act between making sure that we are getting tax revenue from it without making the black market increased. But I mean, if you look at it at the same time, some of these other states have Washington's excise tax is 37%, and they're still raising $314 million a year.
But taxes are but one part of it. There are also concerns about how taking this next step might impact underage consumption, particularly with evidence that premature indulgence impacts brain development negatively. There are still other aspects to consider. Will tax and regulate lead to the state's farmers and cultivators growing product openly here in Vermont in larger quantities? How will it affect the Vermont brand when it comes to the broader tourism and visitor trades? But it's the roadside safety testing and controlling people from driving who shouldn't be that has many in the law enforcement community worried. One of the issues is that while existing tests can determine the presence of THC, the active ingredient in cannabis, it isn't accurate when it comes to determining an amount that would be considered excessive, as can be done with roadside alcohol tests. Manchester's police chief, Michael Hall, also spoke to the question of roadside testing.
Concern that I would have, even before discussing any kind of tax rate or anything like that, is making sure that we have in place all of the mechanisms and legal aspects of what we really should have done before we even legalized marijuana, which would be to have established a presumptive level of THC, in the system, and a roadside test and a testing procedure is a problem for law enforcement at the present time because currently the state has a number of what we refer to as drug recognition experts. And one of the things that's been a topic of discussion on this for some time has been the fact that we were going to have a larger number of DREs available. We were going to have a roadside test available. If you're going to legalize marijuana and sell it and use it as part of your commerce and within the state, every law enforcement officer in the state should be a drug recognition expert. I mean, imagine a situation where you had to call out a alcohol recognition expert every time a person suspected of DUI was pulled over.
A bill to set up a tax and regulate system is before the state Senate, which may pass out its version relatively soon. But the bill faces a more uncertain reception in the House of Representatives, where the House Speaker, Mitzi Johnson, has expressed reservations about the lack of reliable roadside testing. But nevertheless, this is likely to be an issue Vermonters will be hearing a lot more about in the coming weeks and months. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.